Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar of today on Whisper for classification and reorganization. Thank you very much for all of you that are attending, and I guess I should say good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are at the time in the country. My name is Rick Sterling, and I'm the president of Western IM. I'd like to welcome back those of you that have been attending the previous Whisper webinars. And thanks so much for attending the webinar today about classification and reorganization capabilities of our Whisper tool. I think you'll really enjoy this part, those of you that are records and information management professionals. So just a quick note to the technical people again, I always have to do this quick technical note, is the application, the Whisper application is written in .NET, which is very current. It uses RESTful services. It does have an API. It's fast and easy to use, and it's a passive application. Does not negatively impact your users in IT, and I've said this so many times, and I'll keep saying it. It's really, really important to the overall kinds of projects that people undertake. It's generally implemented as a software as a service, a SaaS solution, but can function on-prem if required. So we're talking about classification and reorganization today, but there is still one follow-on webinar that will speak to the migration capabilities in the Whisper tool and how those features could help you with all the different types of projects across your entire organization. The final one will focus on migration of information that you have worked so hard to straighten out in the first 5 webinars, allowing you to get more value from other applications your company either has now or is looking to have in the future, such as SharePoint, Perceptive, Documentum, and a myriad of others. Once you have your information inventoried and cleaned up, the possibilities are absolutely endless. We've been really using these webinars to highlight how Whisper would assist in actual projects. So today we're going to look at classification and reorganization as our focal point while we share the Whisper features with you. So as always, a quick introduction to my partner Troy, the lead developer here at Western IM. And most of you have been introduced to Troy on one or more of the previous webinars. Say hello, Troy.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, hi.
Okay.
Look forward to showing you guys the organization and classification.
Thanks, Troy. So now let me recap. So this is what we've seen in the previous webinars. We saw how we could inventory and validate our physical holdings, boxes, folders, all that kind of thing, filing cabinets, apply retention and disposition so that we could actually get approval to dispose of a whole lot of paper. Then we looked at syncing the metadata from our shared drives, SharePoint sites, Microsoft OneDrive, any USB drives we could find, whole bunch of different web locations like Google and others. And now we're pretty confident, right, as a group that we have our useful collection of metadata in Whisper. So we're done, right? Maybe not. We have the metadata, but what we really want to do is organize and classify all of it so we can deal with that disposition of the electronic information and potentially do lots of reorganization, like actual restructuring of our shared drives potentially. Just keep in mind while we look at the features, Troy is going to show us in a few minutes what Whisper is a passive tool. So Troy's going to keep indicating this is passive as well. It's important, really important in this particular webinar that metadata and folder structures are passively kept, but not actual documents. We don't bring documents into Whisper. Very important during the classification and particularly the reorganization discussion in the webinar today. So Whisper's passive nature alleviates the security considerations that might come into play if we had actually ingested the documents themselves. It allows all of us to accomplish our project goals without troubling IT or your users. We're not actually moving information around in your infrastructure yet, but passively and safely inside Whisper as we complete our projects. We can actually do the job with your team in your own time frame without being impacted by the normal time constraints that always affect us in these situations. And I could actually say that without Whisper, the timing for a project like this could likely never be right. So before we let Troy start to show you some of the features, let's just picture the kinds of things that all of us run into on a regular basis related to organizational structure and where documents and information actually live. How about human resources? Let's just take that as a reference point. HR, as an example, has maybe a bunch of functions that they perform, like onboarding and a whole bunch of other ones. Let's say they have a function called boards and meetings. So maybe within boards and meetings, there's actual activities like creating corporate policy and maybe having monthly meetings. And so there may be, well, things like reports and meeting minutes that they have to deal with. Records classification usually drives the disposition of content, but not all organizations can line up their structures with their classification. If you can, you're very fortunate. Troy will elaborate more on this when I do the handoff. And then the next webinar on migration will fill in a whole bunch more gaps as well. But first, what's our goal in this webinar? Wait, you say, I thought we were just inventorying the corporate information. Yes, but it might be for one or more of several reasons. We might want to be able to safely get rid of our legacy information at the correct moment. I guess that's absolutely true. We want to do that. We want to reorganize our shared drive, and I need a tool that can keep track of retention and disposition information about the unstructured content that lives there. Yeah, or maybe the corporation is thinking of using SharePoint or another tier 1 platform as our corporate solution, and we want to clean things up before we transfer just the right things and not everything to the new system. We have other cloud locations maybe that contain information. Now we know what's there, and we need to be able to get rid of it when the time is right based on appropriate corporate rules. Again, many, many combinations and permutations. And don't forget along the way, as you're listening to Troy today, don't forget that we can ask questions in the Zoom application. So do that for sure, and we'll try to get to all the questions by the end of the webinar today. If we can't for some reason do that, we'll reach out and give you the answers as fast as we can. Now, Troy actually has all kinds of experience with things like import and use of different styles of classification structures and retention schedules, as well as dozens of different combinations of reorganizations and migrations over the last 10 years. So you're going to really enjoy Troy today on the webinar. Now I'm going to hand off to Troy for the remainder of this webinar. There's no fixed project really attached today as in previous webinars, since we would already have synced in our information into Whisper at this point. So many possibilities and possible outcomes in the end. Troy?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Rick. Okay, so here I'll bring up my screen, and we'll actually be looking at the Whisper application as we go through some of the things that I'm going to be doing as part of this webinar. Just to start off, I kind of want to do a little bit of housekeeping on some of the terminology that I'll be using and explain what I mean and what Whisper means when we say these things like functional organization or records classification in particular. So to start, we're going to start looking at what we consider as a functional organization. And in terms of what we'll be looking at today, the main breakdown on how I'm functionally going to be trying to organize some of this information that we synced in or brought in from spreadsheets or OneDrive and all those in previous webinars, we want to kind of mold these into that reorganization part of today's webinar. And the main breakdown I'll be using is something just simple, kind of familiar with most people, is like a department, function, and activity. As Rick was kind of explaining earlier here, we could take HR, for example, where they might have a couple of different functions within the HR department, and each one of those functions might have activities. Things like maybe they have corporate policies and they have meetings associated with developing corporate policies. So a function might be corporate policy development and the activities might be meetings, for example. And how do we kind of reorganize our content that was unstructured out on shared drives or in our filing cabinets or on our SharePoint sites? How does that kind of look when we functionally organize it within how our corporate structure is? Now, this could be very different from different organizations. We've had lots of different implementations of this. Some people like to functionally internally based on projects, or they might want to functionally organize based on things like physical assets or sites, or maybe it's not called departments, maybe it's called divisions. For example, we had one that changed recently from departments to divisions. But all that being said, today we'll kind of keep it simple with this basic three-tiered system of functionally organizing our corporate information from any of our sources into a department function and activity kind of structure. Just to highlight a little bit to what I'm going to call records classification. Now, records classification within Whisper, this is going to be the classification section of today's webinar. Records classification in Whisper is generally applied at the content level. So for example, we might have a file on a shared drive that we want to classify. Classification in Whisper generally drives things like policy, retention schedule, help us flag PII, personal information within content. And that's kind of done at the record level. We'll come back to records classification for the second half of this. In the first half, we'll focus on this functional organization. So let's take a quick look at what I've discussed about our functional organization within Whisper. Right now, this is a familiar screen. We saw this mainly the past 2 weeks with the shared drive and the SharePoint cloud webinars. And essentially here, what I've got is a tree structure breakdown of that functional organization I've been talking about. Our departments, our functions, and our activities. Right now, I'm currently looking at particular departments in this pane that have content in them. I'm just going to uncheck this to see our full functional structure that we're going to be massaging some data into. So we have things like Rick was saying, we have an HR department, we have, administration, human resources, some finance here. Finance will be a big one as well. And then within each one of these departments, they might have common or specific functions and activities. So if we drill down in finance, we might get things like finance might have projects, for example, and underneath projects, this one looks like finance doesn't have too much in the activities for their projects, but this is where we're actually going to be adding some of this information. So let's hop up to the right-hand side and let's look at this particular one. I'm looking at a Brian Sign personnel record here, and this is actually a folder that came from our OneDrive sync from last week. And when we first brought this in, we decided that Brian Hines in the shared drive, the OneDrive location, was brought in as human resources department because that was from the human resources department. And we gave this staff documents and we called it various. Now, various isn't very specific. So if we actually took a little bit closer look at this, let's say we've identified that maybe instead of.
Sorry, Troy, we just lost you. Troy.
Oh,
we just lost you, Troy.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks.
There we go. Okay. So as I was saying, we brought some stuff in from the OneDrive, and we identified it as part of the electronic profiles we saw in previous webinars, is that it was from the human resources department. We identified that. We identified it was some staff documents that came in, but it was we classified it as various. Functionally, we said it was just various documents coming from there. So let's actually update this functional to say, okay, maybe this was internal HR documents. So instead of being under our various, as we browse through our structure here, let's go into human resources, and staff documents. And under various here, we can see we've got Brian and Rick's documents that we brought in from the OneDrive previously. So functionally, I want to move this within Whisper. Again, we're passive. We're not moving the documents on the OneDrive. If I did this functional reorganization tomorrow, when our employees come in and they want to access this document because they're continuing to use that OneDrive moving forward, it still lives on their current workspace, where we're not actually moving it in our corporate infrastructure, but just within Whisper. And this is just basically assigning more specific metadata. So let's move Brian Hines to internal HR documents, and I'm going to update this. So now if I go down into my HR documents, staff documents, And under various, we can see Rick is still there, but we've actually moved, quote unquote, Brian to say that these documents were actually internal HR documents. And this is where we're starting to get our reorganization. How can we take all this information that we've scanned in? We might have applied a couple rules, we might have applied a couple of generic things, but we're going to get a little bit more particular about where each of these fall within our function, our organization. So let me click populate again here. I just want to look at a couple of areas that have content in them. So I'm going to drill down. I believe we were talking about some boards and meetings earlier as well. So under boards and meetings here, we might have our administration boards and meetings. Just like when we hit the drop down here, our predefined drop downs for a functional organization sections, we had 3 here, but maybe we want to add another one. Maybe within boards and meetings here, let's select this OneDrive. This was the top level of the OneDrive we synced in. We can say, okay, under boards and meetings, we only have various. I know that various is not very specific, and maybe I'm sitting with the subject matter expert from administration, and they're saying, well, yeah, we have boards and meetings, but this is how we deal with but we have a monthly board and monthly board meeting, and we have a policy development meeting, and we have a committee that does A and committee that does B. So various isn't helping me organize within the administration department. So let's actually add another one. There's a couple of ways within Whisper to add. I'm just going to right click here and add a new one. So we're right in our functional tree structure here, and we're going to add a new one. We're going to say we've got monthly meetings here. So we're going to add monthly meetings. He's like, great. Okay, now that's one of the activities that we do within our organization. Help me get some of that content you've synced in from our, for this particular one, maybe I'll take our network location. So I'm going to take our network location here. He says, I've got a whole bunch of stuff under our network location that we didn't know anything about. This was actually brought in as unknown. We didn't know what any of this content was. And I'm going to be sitting with this subject matter expert, and they're going to say, you know what, part of that folder structure is our monthly meetings. So help me find my monthly meetings. So I'm going to drill down in here. I'm going to just pick, maybe we're going to say this project status issues was one of their meetings that they had their monthly meetings. How can we move it from this unknown area where we don't know anything about the functional organization of this content from the shared drive? Let's actually say, hey, let's move it into our monthly meeting. So I'm just going to actually click and drag this into our monthly meeting. Now this is where the actual reorganization is happening. We've got a couple of features in Whisper to do things like dragging and dropping, selecting from drop downs, our bulk update feature. This is actually triggering our bulk update feature because I've dragged and dropped it onto our monthly meetings. It's saying, okay, you mean you want that folder to go from where it is on the shared drive, we want to move it into the admin's boards and meetings, monthly meetings activities. So I'm going to hit update here. And we can see, here, just expand this under our monthly meetings. That content that was previously unknown to us or wasn't very specific because we brought it in as various, for example, has now been reorganized within Whisper. Again, tomorrow when the employees people come in and want to access project status issues, they can still go to the shared drive and it still lives in that same place. It's only within Whisper that we've functionally reorganized it. There's a couple of, like I mentioned, there's a couple of ways we can do this, some drag and drop, some changing of metadata. We can actually do it within our data engine role too. So we looked at previously, last 2 webinars on how we are syncing in some of this information. We can apply rules to this where we can say, hey, if you find a particular piece of information, I always want you to classify it functionally, put it into this area. I'm going to take a look at that, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but let's go back to the OneDrive rule that I had. So I moved Brian earlier into the internal HR documents, but let's do that for everything within that OneDrive. We were talking about that OneDrive being HR documents, and that profile, we brought in everything as a various. So I'm going to actually change the rule here and say, you know what, I know that everything on that OneDrive that we brought in, we changed Brian earlier. Let's just change everything that comes in from there to internal HR documents. This is a little bit, again, down in the weeds, but just kind of going to step through this. now next time I run that sync, it's going to apply that rule. So let's take a look at our OneDrive here. So this is the electronic profile I updated the rule for. It brought in everything as HR various. So I'm going to drill down here. Let's take a look at Rick. So we didn't move Rick yet. So Rick is still under various. So human resources, staff documents, various. But I want everything from the OneDrive to go under internal HR documents. So I'm just going to quickly run a resync. And just like I did earlier with Brian, I changed the drop down from various to internal HR documents. But if I actually reload one of Rick's here, pull this up, loading here, we can see that now, right now it's still under various. We'll just do a refresh here. Our various is now gone. We're only looking at populated functional organization. So everything is now under internal HR documents. So again, we're probably working with someone that's identified that OneDrive as all that content. Maybe initially when I started this project, I brought it in as various because I didn't know what it was. And I got that information from the HR department to say our OneDrive is all internal HR documents. Let's create that rule. So when we're syncing in, everything gets put into our internal HR documents, functional organization. So here we've been looking mainly just at the electronic tab. This helps us kind of organize things from the electronic sources. This also applies to the physical content as well. When we bring spreadsheets in, for example, we saw in the first one where we were doing some data validation where our drop downs had specific values. And when we brought in spreadsheets, we were also doing some corrections to match our functional organization. I won't go through the import again, but let's take a look at some of the physical containers. So I'm just hopping over to the containers tab here, away from our electronic tabs. And this is kind of a flat view of all of our what we're calling containers. So I'm going to look at some of that ECO box stuff that we were looking at earlier. So this, during our first webinar, we actually synced in a couple of boxes here. And when we brought these in, this is where we said, okay, ECO, this box here, 006 was personnel files. And this one, that was admin personnel files. And this was executive council personnel files. So we can take actually our physical stuff and apply these kind of same functional organizational rules to that we've done with some of the electronic sources. So let's take a look at what these actually look like, breaking it down and putting that alongside of our electronic stuff in that tree structure to get a very visual picture of how it's falling in line with the rest of our content. So programs, I'm just going to make note, we're going to look at admin programs and personnel files. So let's go over to our electronic tab again. I'm just going to uncheck my electronic tab here. This is just saying, do I want to see our electronic sources because we're on the electronics tab, or do I want to see all of it? And that includes physical ones. Technically behind the scenes, this is just saying anything that has a URL or a network path. Do we want to see that, or do we want to see everything? So I said admin, what was it? Programs, personnel files. So here we can see we actually have one of our physical boxes is falling in line with our electronic content. So under admin HR various, we have an electronic folder, and under the programs, personnel files, we have physical stuff. Again, we can have physical stuff in the right alongside as our personnel records. Let's add one more thing to our personnel records just to see what that looks like. So I'm going to take another folder here from one of our electronic sources. And let me just find one that might, let's say this email one here, it's just got one thing in it. So right now our email, again, we have unknown, unknown, unknown. And I'm like, I know that personnel records that we found in that box. I also have some emails on our shared drive that go along with personnel records. So again, one more time, let's do a drag and drop for this one. And let's put that right alongside the personnel records. Again, we get our bulk update functionality here. And it's saying we're going to move emails, that email folder, to programs personnel files. So let's hit update. So here we can see now right alongside our programs personnel files, we're getting the physical stuff and the electronic emails that might have lived on a shared drive there. Okay. Okay, so let's take this one step further. Within Whisper here, we're getting a good picture of how we're breaking down and applying this functional organization to things. So essentially some more specific structured metadata to content within the system. But how does this apply to our classification? Now, this is where at first we'll keep them separate. Some people have their functional organizations lining up with their records classification. But for this one, we're going to kind of keep it separate. I'll show kind of what that would look like near the end, where we'll kind of tie them maybe directly together, but let's just look at some records classification. Going back to how I was explaining it earlier, the records classification actually comes at the document level within Whisper. So let me grab a piece of content from this monthly meeting once we added here. So we've got a couple of documents within the project status folder that we've functionally organized, but now let's apply some records classification to this. Just to highlight again what I was mentioning earlier, our records classifications will drive policy, retention schedules, help us flag security levels or personal information, for example. This also drives things like be more specific on our retention schedules, as we can do things like, is it event driven? Is this the duration? Is it 7 years, 10 years? Are we doing it on the calendar year, fiscal year? So let's actually take a look at what that looks like within Whisper and how it gets in the system. And then we'll start applying it here to our classification dropdown. Within the admin menu here, we looked at the data engine rule here earlier. We're just gonna hop down to the classification editor. So here's all of our information associated with our classifications. So here I've got a bunch of different classifications here. We can see CC01. Let me hop down to something a little bit more familiar. Maybe we'll filter here. Let's look at, we were dealing with boards and meetings within admin. I'm trying to think of which one's probably education. I'm just trying to find ones that might be, okay, let's do finance. Finance, everybody likes finance. So finance here, we've got a couple of finance classification codes. And behind the scenes, this is kind of all the information we're getting associated with these. This, again, here's our retain. This is how long we're retaining for. Active, calendar year, event-driven, fiscal year. Permanent, this is where we can start flagging things as permanent. If it gets a specific classification, maybe that means it's a permanent record. Final, this is, selective. We got some more stuff coming later on with selective retentions, but here we can specify, is it destroy? Is it, a review period is often used as a final step, and maybe that triggers the event date to be updated. Here's where we can start flagging some PII information. By default, if I specify that a record in our system is Finance 02, maybe that means that all Finance 02 documents by default are flagged as having personal information. When we get to looking at some records that we apply this to, we can turn this on and off. If we've specified it's a Finance 02 document that isn't personal information, this is the default that's applied when applying the retention. And we get some more specific information here as well, scope notes, some legal citations, something a little bit more specific that we don't necessarily need to see when we're looking at the records, but as reference material when we need to look up we're looking for invoices, for example. We want to filter in here to show me invoice classification so it can help me classify documents when I'm applying them. So let's hop back over to what we're looking at here. And let's just do this manually. So I've picked this first record in our boards and meetings documents here that we brought in. And here I'm just gonna say we've got none applied to it. That was the default we brought in from the electronic profile that we created a couple weeks ago. So I'm gonna say boards and meetings. Let's actually apply, let's see here. This is status. I'm just going to try to find, let's stick with that Finance 02 one. Maybe this is a finance. So here's where the separation might happen, in that we might functionally organized documents into this area within Whisper, our monthly meetings, but our monthly meetings might have multiple different types of documents associated with it. For example, our meeting minutes might have a different classification than our, maybe there's some expense forms. There's travel that's associated with this meeting, and we functionally want to keep all of our meeting information together. So within Whisper, we have our expense forms, our meeting minutes, our reports, but each one of those types of documents have a different classification. So that's kind of where we like to keep it separate. There are some instances where your functional organization will directly reflect your classification. Maybe you're organizing things based on type of documents. So the bottom level is expense forms, so that that area of your functional organization might correspond directly to a records classification. We can help apply that direct correlation with that data rules that we were looking earlier. When we brought in the Google OneDrive documents, we specified that that was an internal HR document. We would also then create a corresponding rule that says, just like I did for this one, also apply the records classification for those same type of documents. When you functionally organize it, also records classify it. Okay, so let's actually apply here, Finance 02. I should have made note to Finance 02, but it looks like here our event date is still grayed out. So this must mean this is not an event-driven classification. And we're saying to and from dates are 2018 here. So let's hit save. So this first document was then classification's been updated to 02. And what we can see happening here is this is where we're starting to get our projected date. Projected dates are, it could mean a couple of different things. Within Whisper, we call it a projected date because it could mean review. It could be projected disposition date. It could be projected archival date. So we just call it a projected date. And based on the classification's last final activity is what that projected date actually means. Great, so I've got a couple of things that I've already kind of classified in here. I'm gonna hop over to a couple of different tabs here to take a look at how we then have applied some classification from previous webinars where we've synced things in. Some of those we did apply some rules. We also had the physical content that we scanned in the first webinar, did have some classifications on them as well. Let's actually take a look at what might be ready for meeting its projected date. So I'm gonna hop over to our disposition tab here. Couple of different ways within Whisper we can start finding some of this stuff where tell me everything that's met its projected date. Here's our basic view here. It's sorting, organizing this stuff by container. So here we can see we've got a couple of contracts. The date is actually yesterday. So as of yesterday, this is all of the content in my system that has met its projected disposition date. We've applied some HR 01 here. This was an event-driven date as of 2018 or 2008, and it looks like this was a 7-year disposition period. So as of 2015, this document would have met its projected date based on the classification that we gave it. Again, here we have David Sawyer. I don't actually know anybody in my family named David, but for example, here we had HR applied to this one. He didn't, these types of documents for this one, it was a leave form, for example. We didn't have a to and from date on the leave form for whatever reason. We just had the event date. And essentially what happened with this one is I said the event date for Sawyer Troy, or Sawyer David, was actually the date he left the company. So when he left the company, I came in here and applied the date of, well, it looks like they're not the same, say March 10th. That's when he left the company. So that's when I wanted to start the retention period. As of 2019, these two documents would have been ready to go. So let's take a look at a couple other ways. The other way we like to do this is some people might want to look at everything that's within a container that's ready to go. Maybe it's a box. We want to do disposition on this organization. We actually group the documents by personnel. That personnel, let me know when everything's done and ready to go for that personnel. They left more than, looks like 7 years ago. So this is documents that we can now clean up. And that just gives you a view of everything that's complete. we've done a whole bunch of different types of classification in the system. So let's look into the future, say 8 years from now. So as of today, this is all I have that's ready to go. So let's say 8 years from now. Let's go 8 years from now. Let's take a look at some other stuff that's ready to go. Let me clear this filtering. Okay, so 8 years from now, 2028, we're going to have a lot more ready to go. Here's a bunch of different types of documents and containers within Whisper that are ready to go. We had that ECO 0010 box that we scanned in and the physical records. That will be ready to go. All of the dates here will be ready to go by 2028. Looks like a 2023. We have some of our electronic folders on our shared drive. All the contents in a couple of our electronic folders could be cleaned up. We've got this one we already said was ready to go. So we've got a couple of different things here that are ready to go. I just want to, now that we've got kind of how this is coming together here, we've got some stuff ready to go. What can we do? I just want to go back to, we looked at this in our first webinar and some of the reporting. I want to generate some reports on this. And this is how we're going to handle maybe having a review process and a sign off for us to be able to clean something up. So let's pick an area on our shared drive, for example, or actually our Google Drive here. Last week we saw stuff on an ACWAC meeting. So I have this folder here that lives on our Google Drive, and I want sign off to be able to get rid of this. I want to delete this folder on our Google Drive. It's met I've applied a classification to it. It's met its retention schedule. We're at the projected date. Let me generate a report on this to get sign off. Maybe this person isn't a Whisper user, so let's generate a report to send out to them. So I'm up on my print here. I'm going to generate a container. I'm going to look at just this one folder for this particular instance, and I want to send this off it looks like this is land and resources. We did land and resources. We're going to send it off to the supervisor over there and say, here's some stuff that's ready to go. Actually, here, let me not do the folder one. Let me do the other one. This one's tailored more to this repository. So again, just a recap on the reporting mechanism. Essentially, we have three main ways to do it. And we kind of looked at this as left-hand side of the screen is the report, right-hand side with its content, or the content report if we had one particular piece of content selected. So let's take a look at this. Here's a report, and it's based on this Google Drive location. And I said, here's a bunch of files and folders within that folder on the Google Drive that have met projected disposition date. I put a little sign box in here, and maybe this is how we get our sign off to be able to dispose of this. Again, we're passive. That Google Drive still lives out in the Google Drive. It's still organized the way that that department is using it. Our functional reorganization that we did only lives within Whisper. It wasn't moved. It wasn't brought into the system. They still have their Google Drive as they see it today. We've just brought it into Whisper. We've functionally organized it within our organizational functional structure. Department function activity in this case. We've given it some classifications, so the documents are going to be have policies associated with them. It'll have a duration and how long we kept them for. And then when that has been met in 2028, we've then brought up that information within Whisper, generated our report to go and get sign off that area of the shared drive, or in this case, the OneDrive can be cleaned up. So that's kind of back to end on. We saw in previous ones, we had a whole bunch of information. What do we do with it? We functionally organized it. We've created a couple of new activities or departments with the subject matter experts. We've moved our content into that functional organizational structure. We've used rules and manual ways to apply classification where we've set some dates. And based on those dates in that records classification, we've then saw the document go through its retention period, and at the end we generated a report to be able to deal with it.
Well, Troy, great presentation on that. By the way, everybody, I enjoy this is Rick. I enjoy the presentations just as much as all of you do when Troy does them. It really highlights to me, Troy, that when you're doing this kind of these kinds of projects, that you really need to sit down with your subject matter experts in those various areas in the organization and get the right information from them. And then that makes your job, lightens the load a lot to be able to go and reorganize, restructure all of these things beforehand. Also, of course, builds kind of positive things between all the information management professionals and the departments or business units that when they're working with the SMEs along the way as well. So that when the time comes that things maybe need to be disposed of, that everybody's in the loop and kind of bought into the process. So really, really important, I think.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And if there is that one magic person in an organization that knows everything, you're very lucky. But often we do need that feedback from departments in this case, or the subject experts. Usually the people that are creating the documents know the most about those documents, and that's who we've got to ask.
Well, Troy, you did such a great job that there's no questions being asked. So I think that's a really testament to the presentation today.
Take the silence as golden.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
No, it's great. I really like going through this, and it as Rick was saying too, these kinds of presentations also kind of help us solidify in our minds kind of our processes and what we see that's working. Might not be the end all to things, and we definitely like working with our clients to help build out these processes to make them the most useful for each particular case.
Well, that's great, Troy. Thanks so much, and thank you all for attending the Whisper Classification and Reorganization webinar today. I hope you've seen kind of what a great job Whisper would do in assisting you in organizing, classifying, and passively shifting the information in your organization. So we hope that you'll be able to attend the last webinar in the series dealing with the really interesting and complex topic of migration. Whisper can assist in migrations in a multitude of ways to a multitude of platforms. In fact, the migration webinar might be a really good one to invite someone from IT to sit in with you on if you don't already have them with you now. So I'd like to thank you all again one more time for coming to our webinar today and the series up till now, because many of you have been on all of the webinars in this series. And you'll be receiving an email shortly. That's the 20th of March for the migration webinar. Thanks again very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, everyone.